Welcome back, everyone, to The Deep Dive. Today, we are diving into a topic that I think is going to be super relevant to a lot of our listeners, especially here in California, and that is wrongful eviction.
Absolutely.
We've gone through a bunch of sources, FAQs, legal guides, analyses, all kind of with a focus on what it means to be a tenant in California and what your rights are, especially when it comes to the legal side of things.
Yeah.
So let's get right into it.
Sure.
What exactly is a wrongful eviction?
Well, a wrongful eviction basically is when a landlord is trying to take the law into their own hands and force a tenant to leave without following the proper legal procedures.
So basically cutting corners instead of going through the court.
Exactly. And this typically involves these illegal self-help tactics like changing the locks, removing your belongings, or even just harassing you to the point that you feel like you have to leave. All of these are big no-nos under California law.
So that brings up the question, what does the legal eviction process look like in California?
Right. So in California, a landlord who wants to evict a tenant legally has to go through the courts. And there are a few key steps. First, they have to provide proper written notice. The type and length of notice depends on the reason for the eviction. But if after that notice period the tenant hasn't left, then the landlord has to file a lawsuit in court. That's called an unlawful detainer action.
Unlawful detainer action.
Exactly. And to actually legally remove you, the landlord has to get a court order from a judge.
So it sounds like there is a process in place to protect tenants and make sure everything is above board.
Absolutely.
So with that in mind, what are some of the big tenant rights people should be aware of in California?
Okay, so California gives tenants a lot of really important rights. One of the most important is the right to a habitable living environment.
Habitable.
Yes. So this means your landlord has to maintain the property in a safe and livable condition. So think of things like making necessary repairs, dealing with mold, pest infestations, anything that could affect your health and safety.
So it can't just be a complete and total disaster.
Yeah, right.
It actually has to be a place that is livable.
Exactly.
Gotcha. So what other rights should California renters be aware of?
Another huge one is protection against discrimination. In California, a landlord can't discriminate against you based on a whole list of protected characteristics. Your race, color, national origin, religion, sex, which includes gender identity and sexual orientation, disability, family status, age, ancestry, marital status, source of income, even veteran or military status.
Wow. That's quite a comprehensive list.
It is, and that applies to everything from applying to a place to the lease terms and even the eviction process.
Okay, so it sounds like California is taking tenant discrimination seriously.
Very seriously.
And what other rights should we know about?
Right, and then we also have the right to due process. We talked about this a little earlier, but if a landlord takes you to court to evict you, you have the right to be notified about the lawsuit, file a response, and even present your side to a judge.
It's not just one-sided. You get to tell your side of the story as well.
Exactly, yeah. And then finally, one thing a lot of tenants might not know is that if you're paying your rent on time and following the rules of your lease, you generally can't be evicted just because your lease ends.
That's a good thing to know, because I think a lot of people just assume that if their lease is up, they have to move out, but that's not the case.
Exactly, yeah. Unless the landlord has a valid legal reason and follows the correct procedures, you can stay put.
So you have a lot more power than you think in that situation.
Absolutely.
So we talked about a lot of the rights, but now let's get into the things landlords can't do. What are some specific things that are red flags for tenants?
Okay, so a lot of things that we talked about earlier, those self-help evictions, again, those are illegal. But beyond that, a landlord can't just enter your property without proper notice, like we said earlier, unless it's an emergency or they have a court order.
Makes sense. It's your home.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they can't harass you. That's any kind of harassment, whether it's verbal, physical, or sexual harassment.
Harassment of any kind.
Right. And again, failing to keep the property habitable is also a no-go.
Right. We touched on that before.
And of course, conducting unlawful evictions, whether that's through those self-help methods or retaliation for you asserting your rights, that's also illegal. And again, discrimination based on those protected characteristics we talked about earlier, absolutely forbidden.
So this brings up a good question. What happens if a landlord does break the rules? What can a tenant do?
First things first, document everything.
Document.
Keep a record of everything. So that means like write down every incident, any communication with your landlord, whether it's emails, texts, even phone calls. Write down the date, the time, what was said. If it's relevant, take pictures, take videos, just to prove what's going on.
So you have a record.
Exactly. Then the next step is to try to talk to your landlord about it, but do it in writing. So write a letter or an email clearly explaining the problem and what you want done about it.
Right, so you have a paper trail.
Exactly. And if it's a serious issue, like something impacting health or safety or violating building codes, report it to your local code enforcement agency.
They can come in and make sure things are up to code.
Right. Now, if it's getting really serious, you might want to think about getting legal help. A landlord-tenant attorney or tenant rights organization can give you advice specific to your situation.
So it's never too early to reach out for legal help.
Exactly. And if you think you've been discriminated against, you can also file a complaint with the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing, DFEH.
They handle discrimination cases.
Exactly. Now, sometimes people ask about withholding rent as a way to get their landlord's attention, and it is a legal option in California, along with this thing called repair and deduct. But those are tricky. There are strict rules you have to follow, so always get legal advice before you do anything like that. Because if you don't follow the rules, you could actually end up in a worse position and even get evicted for not paying rent.
Right, so it's not as simple as it sounds.
Not at all. And then I guess as a last resort, you can always sue your landlord for damages. But again, talk to a lawyer first.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of general things, but let's circle back to discrimination because that's something our sources really emphasized. It seems like California has really strong protections against discrimination in housing.
They do. The Fair Employment and Housing Act, FEHA, is really comprehensive. It's illegal to discriminate at any point in the renting process, like from how a place is advertised to showing the property, the lease terms, and even during evictions.
So it's not just about getting the apartment, it's the whole process.
The whole thing. And if you think you've been discriminated against, you can file a complaint with DFEH. You can also sue the landlord directly. And if you win, you could get money for your losses, and the court could force the landlord to stop the discrimination.
So you have options.
You do.
So for someone who is facing a potential wrongful eviction or some of these other issues we've been talking about, how do you even begin to find a lawyer who can help?
Yeah, finding a lawyer can be tough. Start by asking around. Ask friends, family, maybe community organizations that work with tenants. Then do some research online. Look for lawyers who specialize in landlord-tenant law, specifically evictions.
Right, you want someone who knows what they're doing.
Exactly. And then make sure they're actually licensed to practice law in California. You can check that on the State Bar website. Then I'd recommend setting up consultations with a few different lawyers. That way you can get a feel for their communication style, how professional they are, and if they really understand your situation.
It's like an interview.
Yeah, exactly. And during that consultation, don't be afraid to ask about their strategy for your case and their fees.
It's your case. You need to know what's going on.
Absolutely. And then reading online reviews, testimonials from other clients, that can help too. But at the end of the day, trust your gut feeling. You want someone you feel comfortable with, confident in, someone you can communicate with easily.
That makes sense. Now, speaking of legal resources, our sources today highlighted the Martinez Law Center. What can you tell us about them?
Well, from what I've seen, the Martinez Law Center focuses specifically on representing tenants in California. They seem to specialize in things like wrongful evictions, unlawful detainer actions, and other real estate issues. They cover Orange County, Riverside, San Diego, and Los Angeles. They really emphasize understanding tenant rights and how complicated these laws can be.
And they seem to really know the ins and outs of those particular areas in Southern California.
Yeah, exactly. So for anyone in those areas who might be facing a wrongful eviction, the Martinez Law Center seems like a good place to start. You can find them at martinezlawcenter.com. They offer case assessments, they can explain your rights, help you figure out what to do, and even represent you in court.
So they seem like a good resource.
They do.
So we've covered a lot of ground here today. And it sounds like there are resources and legal options available to tenants in California who are facing a wrongful eviction. But what exactly can a lawyer do for someone in this situation?
Right. So if a landlord breaks the law with an illegal eviction, the courts can hold them accountable. Like, they can actually be fined for their actions. And tenants, they can sue for things like emotional distress, the cost of finding a new place, and even the difference in rent if their new place is more expensive.
So you can get compensated for the trouble the landlord caused.
Exactly. And sometimes, depending on the situation and the local laws, you can even get more money than your actual losses as a way to punish the landlord for what they did.
So there are real consequences for landlords who don't play by the rules.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a super informative deep dive into tenant rights and wrongful evictions in California. I think we've learned a lot today.
Yeah, me too.
What's the biggest takeaway for our listeners today?
I think the most important thing to remember is that as a renter in California, you have rights. You're protected by the law. Knowing your rights and knowing the proper procedures is the best way to protect yourself from a wrongful eviction.
So knowledge is power. And if you think your rights have been violated, document everything and get legal advice as soon as possible. The Martinez Law Center at martinezlawcenter.com is a good place to start, especially if you're in those Southern California counties we talked about.
Yeah, and remember, this is just a starting point. You may need to dig deeper depending on your situation. Think about what really stood out to you today or what you're still unsure about. Maybe it's how to prove harassment or the specific rules around repair and deduct. There's always more to learn about your rights as a tenant in California.
That's a great point. There's always more to learn. But on that note, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See that?
Call now 714-442-9741. Thank you.